you have a practice or are you running a business? Valuation is the ultimate KPI.
Hey there, it's Mike Langford. Welcome to the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast, brought to you by Trulytics, the one and only comprehensive advisor transition management platform. This week's episode is going to lean into something that is so important to the true modern financial advisor and the firms that support them, be they broker-dealers, RIAs, or other. That concept that you hear in the intro bumper of every episode of this show, the "do you have a practice or are you running a business?" will be front and center of this episode. My guest this week is Dan Cuprill, and he runs a firm called Advisor Architect that helps advisors transform their practices into thriving, profitable businesses. And Dan knows a thing or two about running a profitable advisory business because he owns a very successful advisory firm himself. Dan is also a CFP, a chartered financial consultant, and a chartered life underwriter. You can learn more about Dan by visiting advisorarchitect.com. And while you're there, check out his podcast. It's called The Profitable Advisor. Before we dive in, please do make sure you like and subscribe to the Modern Financial Advisor podcast on your platform of choice. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcast jam on. Also, make sure you share this episode via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook because as I've learned over my years in this industry, many advisors, even the top producers, are not running highly profitable businesses. Now, it may look like it from the outside, but you never know, right? The piece of content that you share, like this podcast, might just land in their stream at the right time and help them a lot when they need it most, right? So please do share this out. Okay, let's get to our conversation with Dan Cuprill. Well, Dan, great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me today. Happy Friday to you.
Michael, it's great. Same to you. And it's been a pleasure. I thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It was interesting. I was turned on to you by a colleague that you and I have in common. Mm-hmm. And then I'm like, well, I got to go check out Dan's podcast. And the first episode I listened to was like, oh, yeah, he's perfect because he and I have like the same mindset on a lot of things. And we'll dig into that podcast later in the show, that particular episode. But it's really nice.
That's actually kind of scary that there's somebody else out there who thinks the way I do. But
it's true, right? Especially we all have those moments where you're like, am I the only one with these thoughts rattling through my head?
I've been called the odd one in the family, so I understand.
That's okay. Hey, look, the odd ones get stuff done. They change the world, as they say, right? So I wanted to kick today's show off with a line that you kind of just tossed out there in the conversation we were having a few days ago in prepping for this podcast. You tossed it out there, and I'm like, oh, I think I want to title this episode of the podcast this phrase that you used. So you use this phrase, be your own wealthiest client. And you talked about it from the perspective of, what you're encouraging advisors to do.
Right.
And I thought that's a fantastic way to set the stage for what the people listening to the show, this particular episode, can get from this podcast. So what do you mean when you say be your own wealthiest client to your clients, to the advisor world?
So much of what financial advisors define as success, or the idea of a successful practice that so many of them have, is rarely an idea they created. It's an idea that was usually motivated by their product vendors, specifically turnkey asset managers, FMOs, insurance brokerages, the very providers of the products that most financial advisors provide to their clients. And these organizations motivate advisors to run their operation like sales offices. Do whatever you can to hit high volume of revenue. Now, the implication is that if you have high revenue, you will have high profit, and you yourself will become wealthy. Unfortunately, that doesn't hold true. In fact, I'm so disturbed every time I meet people who've been an advisor for 30, 40 years, and with their assistance, show them the millions of dollars that they've brought in revenue-wise, and then compare that to their net worth, which is small by comparison. I'm so disturbed by that I get very vocal to where I try to emphasize to financial advisors that, look, if you've lost sight of why you're owning a business, well, you're going to go out of business.
Right.
And the truth of the matter is that there are a lot of financial advisors who I like to call broke millionaires. They generate over $1 million a year in revenue. They are not wealthy. And they set goals for their operation based purely on revenue, not profitability, and not their own personal net worth. Now, I think some of them have a belief that in the end, they will have a whole team of buyers knocking on their door, looking to pay them multi-millions of dollars. And in that case, then they don't have to worry about getting wealthy now. But you and I know that's not the case. And we're not publicly traded companies for the most part. We just can't look at what our value is of our company. Even if the most sophisticated valuation program can be done, you still got to find a buyer. You still got to find somebody who's willing to give up the money. So I have always encouraged financial advisors to set a goal for themselves to become their own wealthiest client. I mean, here we are spending a lot of time showing people how to become wealthy and how to keep that wealth and how to have a very comfortable retirement and to have peace of mind during retirement. And yet, so many of us don't do it ourselves. We're almost like dentists with bad teeth. So I think a very easy way to set the goal of your own wealth is to draw a comparison to your best clients, to your largest clients, because most of them came from nothing. I mean, it's the fact of life in America that even though, I know there is generational wealth, it's still the rarity by far.
Right.
And if you look at those clients that you have who may have been the first person in their family to go to college and who did it the right way and followed your principles, you as the advisor, well, they've amassed a fair amount of wealth. Well, why don't you do the same thing? You may never get to be your wealthiest client. I doubt I will be because mine's pretty big and he worked really, really hard, probably harder than I would want to work. But I can get close. And to me, that's why you become a business owner. Now, I don't want anybody to think that sometimes when someone implies it's about becoming wealthy, that is in some way a negative thing. And I think that if anyone feels that way, they need to examine that belief too, because when you are wealthy or when you do become your biggest client, you're going to be able to do a lot of great things for a lot of great people with that wealth. So there, money, I don't want to sound cliche, but, we all know all the adages about money, but the truth remains that you'll be able to impact a lot of people in your life if you focus on developing your own net worth. You got to do it the right way.
Sure.
But I have met so many advisors who are 40 years in, and some of them like to delude themselves a little bit. They like to say, I just have the fire. I don't think I'm ever going to retire. But the truth of the matter is they can't.
Yeah.
They can't. They've never amassed enough so that they could just turn on the spigot on their savings. They have to continue to work. And that's okay if that's what you love to do. But in a lot of cases, it's not. Or sometimes our health deteriorates. I mean, eventually our health goes away.
Yeah.
So that's why I say, look, you should, and really it's a two-part goal. Strive to be your largest client. That doesn't mean you fire all your wealthy clients.
It's just all you losers got to go. I'm sorry, you have too much money. You're making me look bad.
I don't want someone to go, I only have $500,000, so I fired everybody over 500,000. No, that's not where I'm going to go to. All right. But define your success as a business owner by your liquid net worth. I mean, if you have to do it on a quantitative measurement, that's what I would do. I wouldn't do it based on the revenue or your assets under management or anything like that. Base it on how am I growing my wealth? And secondly, am I getting that peace of mind about my own finances that I work so darn hard to give my clients? If you achieve those two things, then I think you really have defined a level of success that's appropriate for you and not some product vendor who really doesn't care if you're profitable or not. They just want you to keep selling product.
It's really interesting, Dan. You're echoing several things that we have been beating the drum on with this podcast and Truelytics, obviously the presenting firm of this podcast have been beating this drum. Number one, at the intro of this podcast, you hear, do you have a practice or do you have a business, right? And there is a distinction there. And I think that's what you're getting at, is that, many of the folks are running their business, if you will, as if it's a job that they own, number one. It's a sales business. And you and I were talking the other day that much of that arose because many of the financial advisors who have been in this business for the 25, 30, 40 years, as you mentioned, they got their start when they were called stockbrokers.
Yeah.
They were told to sell, and they didn't think of themselves as business owners.
Well, you're too kind. Let's go even further. And I can say these things because I'm one of them. All right. I did not go to college to study finance. Had no interest in it. I was a journalism major. I met a lot of people in college who couldn't cut it in business school. So after their second year in, and they couldn't get into the undergraduate business program, they switched to communications. And their attitude was, well, I'm kind of a sales guy, so I'm going to go into sales, whatever it is that I do. And a lot of those found their way in financial services. And they did it for a number of reasons. To be less kind, it's because it was one of the few opportunities they had available to them, because their major was kind of broad. But the other reason is they saw it as a chance to have a rather lucrative lifestyle, because it does afford that. The margins are very good. So unfortunately, that is just one discipline, though, when it comes to running a business. You need to be able to do more than just sell. Now, I'm not picking on financial advisors alone, because really I could look at any discipline. A doctor, be the greatest healer in the world and have absolutely no idea how to run his practice like a business.
Yeah.
A baker. There's a classic book, which I hope everyone who's listening to this has read. If not, you should go get it as soon as you're done listening to this show, of course. called The E-Myth by Michael Gerber. And it was written probably about 40 years ago. It's been revised a few times since then. But Gerber calls, the E in the E-Myth stands for entrepreneur. And he says, look, it's a myth that they call themselves entrepreneurs. They are not entrepreneurs. And in fact, to me, that's one of the most, that and the word coach are the two most used and abused words in our language, in our business language today. Because by Gerber's definition, and I agree with it fully, an entrepreneur doesn't work in his business. He works on his business. So if he is the baker and he bakes bread better than anyone else, and he's the only one who's allowed to bake the bread, he is not an entrepreneur. He may own the business, but you take him out of the equation, the business doesn't run. Right. On the other hand, if he develops a system for other people to bake bread so that they can bake it almost as good as he can bake it. In fact, the only person who can tell it's not as good as his is himself. And he trains other people to do that so that he doesn't have to bake the bread and he can now expand his operation or do whatever he wants to do. That is a true entrepreneur. And that's where we've kind of lost sight, because what we've done here is we've gotten to this idea of selling. And selling's great. It's part of the business, but it's just one part of the business. And this is why I see people who on paper, at least if you just look at the income part of their income statement, you don't look at the expenses, they're on their P&L, they look highly successful. But when you then get beyond that, you start to see that they really do have a crappy sales job. And it's because so many of us were never trained that way. Now, don't get me wrong. You're not going to get a lot of that type of training even in business school. You're just not. You're going to have to learn it through a number of ways. But I feel very strongly that you have to understand that the goal of any business is to not only be extremely profitable, but to be structured in such a way that it can be easily sold. And if you are the centerpiece of that operation, it can't be sold. Or if it's going to be sold, it's not going to be sold for what you think it should be sold for.
Yeah.
Because you're an integral part, right?
Well, it's interesting. We've talked a lot about that on this podcast, especially in the early days of this podcast, the first few episodes. We talked a lot about valuation and how it's the ultimate KPI of your business. And one of the big distinctions that Terry Mullen, the founder of the firm, and others were making is, look, a lot of people think about valuation as a multiple of revenue. And that's the price. That's a formula that you calculate after the price has been paid. What was the multiple of revenue? The real thing that somebody's buying from you and the thing you should be building is the cash flow that business generates, right? The profitability and the resultant cash flow that comes out of that business, right? So you can have a really high revenue number and I can have that same revenue number. They're not equally valued businesses for a variety of reasons. One might be way more profitable, be producing way more cash flow. So it's a more efficient business. There's other components to it too. One might be easier for me to, as you say, as an acquiring advisor or acquiring business, to be able to walk in and go, that's plug and play.
Yeah.
That investment process you have, the systems in place that you have for managing and interacting with your clients, I don't have to relearn it and take all your special snowflake stuff that you've developed that only is up in your head, as you're saying. The recipe for your bread is in your head and you're the only one who can do it. I could walk in and, like, literally, if you decided to go hang out on a beach in a couple of months after the transition took place, this business is mine and it's continuing to go. So I really like where you're going with that. Let me ask you something.
Mm-hmm.
When did you first have this aha moment that you were running your advisory business differently than most advisors? You mentioned that you've developed your business differently, and it really has afforded you a different kind of lifestyle than many advisors have.
Right.
What was that moment where you came to, you're like, yeah, I've got something here and I need to kind of evangelize it and start teaching other advisors how to do that?
Well, so one of the things I always want to emphasize is that there are no new good ideas. In fact, Mark Twain said it long, long time ago. There are no new ideas. Everything's already been thought of. It's just, he described it as a kaleidoscope. You twist the glass and they look different, but at the end of the day, they're same old pieces of colored glass. And so I feel very much the same way. What helped me was I did come into this industry through a slightly non-traditional manner. I came in through the property and casualty side at the company level. So I worked for a corporation, the Chubb Corporation, which was a very good business to work for, to learn how to run a business. Now, I knew almost by year 2, this was not my future. But in terms of what it took to run a business, to do it right, you learned a lot about systems. And when I say systems, I'm not even talking computers, because you got to remember, I'm 57 years old. So when I came into the working world in the mid 80s, they were computers, but not like today. So It was really, the systems were the process. The other thing that happened when I did decide to go out on my own, and I thought about it for a good year and a half. It wasn't something that I just got frustrated and decided I was going to do. But I mentioned earlier the book, The E-Myth. And if I have one gift, it is the ability or the willingness to read a book and apply what the book says. So I talk a lot about advisors about ideas and implementation. And I said, look, I'm going to give you ideas. Frankly, you heard them before. The difference is we're going to make you implement them. So that's what I was able to do from the beginning. That old analogy that Gerber talks about the baker owning the bakery and baking the bread really stuck with me. Now, keep in mind, you don't get there overnight. If you're just starting out and you have no clients and you have a minimal amount of money, you got to bake the bread.
Right.
Bread's got to get baked. And I'm not a fan of just going out and running up a bunch of debt and hiring a bunch of bakers that you can't afford. No, that's silly. But you have to aspire to that. You have to start setting aside money for that. You have to start building systems so that eventually you can train that person. And in my case, it was, to be candid, it was pure laziness. I wanted to be able to step away. No, it's true.
Yeah, I love it though.
I wanted to be able to step away and do whatever I wanted to do, not have a quote unquote real job, and be able to come back when I wanted to come back. And over time, that seed just continued to grow. And as I started to build the practice, it got to the ultimate point when I heard, it was Dan Kennedy who said, that the real power of being an entrepreneur is you can live anywhere you want, which is quite powerful when you consider he lives in Cleveland. Right? But Now, listen, don't get mad at me. I lived in Cleveland for 4 years in high school, and I still consider it my adopted hometown. I do. I live in
That's
Cincinnati
funny.
and Nashville now. But the point was, when I heard that, I was like, you're right. I don't even want to live in Cincinnati anymore. So we moved to Nashville. I still have an apartment in Cincinnati for the time that I'm there, but it's not very often. Why is that? Because the planning firm now runs itself. There are people there, there are systems there that allow for it to run without me having to be there on a regular basis. I basically come in, I monitor it. I do work on a lot of the marketing aspects because that's something that's creative and I enjoy it tremendously. But in terms of the actual, very little face-to-face interactions with clients, we have people that do that. And I spend very little time actually doing the analysis work that I used to do. It's really more done at a 10,000 foot level. But again, I got to give the credit to the fact that I was exposed to it early. And then secondly, if I have any gift, it's not that I created these ideas. I did not. I just wasn't afraid to implement them.
It's that taking action concept, right? We've all done that. We've all heard, whether it's a speaker or read a book or watched a documentary, or you remember for your classes, whatever it is, or the person who's heard from a personal trainer or whatever. It's like, okay, it's great. You got the information. You got to do something with
Well,
it.
let me stop you there because that personal trainer analogy is the absolute perfect analogy. So when I turned 50, I was out of shape. My blood sugar was getting dangerously high, not dangerously, but to that point where they're like, if you don't do something, you're going to be a diabetic. And so I was like, all right, fine. I'm realistic about myself. I really like food and I hate to exercise. Now, I was a relatively athletic kid, but the thought of working out, no, I hated it.
Yeah.
So I had to be realistic with myself. And no matter how hard I tried to motivate myself, I realized the only way that I was ever going to be able to do this was to hire somebody who was going to meet me at a certain date at a certain time. And I was going to get it done. I couldn't blow it off because out of respect to her, I couldn't blow her off, So she's like, yep, 7 a.m, we'll be here at the gym 3 days a week and I will kick your ass. And that's what she does. And I hate it. All these people, I get all this out of working out. Great. God bless you. I do not. I do not. But okay. But that was a structure. That was a structure that I needed to implement good health. So sometimes you can get it that way. You can get it by somebody, putting that structure in place for you. Other times you have to ask yourself, well, what happens if I don't change? What happens if I don't take the approach that ultimately makes me my largest client? How will I feel if I'm still having to work at 70, 75? How will I feel if I ultimately outlive all my clients? What's that going to do to my business? And these are the types of questions that advisors really need to have with themselves. I think that our industry is safe in many areas if you take the time to modernize the way you do business. But if you're just going to be a product provider, which I think the traditional model of chasing revenue is all about, then I think the future is very vulnerable for you. And I worry about, how many advisors there'll actually be in the future. There'll always be some, but
Yeah.
ones who follow the more traditional approach, I think they're going to be in for a reckoning.
Yeah, I agree. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about benchmarks. You mentioned in our prep call that you participated in the DFA benchmarking survey. And we recently had Catherine Williams from DFA, who actually runs that benchmarking survey and the production of the reports that comes out. And she joined Terry Mullen, CEO of Trulytics, and this gentleman by the name of Tom Orecchio, who's the CEO of Modera Wealth Management, and myself, for a pretty expansive conversation on the topic of benchmarking. A couple of big takeaways that came out of that. One was benchmarks need to be actionable, and that kind of builds on what we were just talking about, right? The ability to take action on something that you see. And the second was that it needs to be timely and current, right? Having a benchmark that was relevant 10 years ago, as an example, is an extreme case of like, it might not be relevant today if you're measuring yourself against that.
Right.
But Tom, in that episode of the podcast, he said, listen, the benchmarks that we were looking at the tail end of 2019 and we were having our partners meeting and making our plans for 2020, we said, hey, listen, if no growth happens and this stuff stays the same, we're going to have a killer 2020 based on all the work we've been doing these last couple of years. And then literally within, 45 days,
Mhm.
the world was flipped upside down.
Yeah.
And so those benchmarks were no longer applicable anymore. When you talk to advisors, what kind of benchmarks do you look at most frequently that help them make progress? Kind of, again, building on that analogy, you talk to a personal trainer and she's working with you, she's probably got a couple of, one, two or three things, right, that you could focus on to help you make the most progress for you. And they're probably applicable for most clients of hers as well. When you do that with your clients in the advisory space, what are the benchmarks that you're looking at that really help them make progress?
Yeah, rightly or wrongly, I use my own practice as the example of what can be done. Now, I don't have a perfect practice, okay?
Okay.
But compared to averages, compared to benchmarking studies that you pointed out, it's pretty good. And
Yeah.
so my attitude is always, if I can do it, you can do it. I mean, and it's true. I mean, I might, I don't know, maybe I have the above average intelligence, but I assure you it's not super above average, okay? So I don't have any special gifts or anything like that. So if I can do it, you can do it. And the first thing that I look at is, and it's amazing how few advisors even know these answers, is I look at their P&L, their detailed profit and loss statement, which for most financial advisors, when I say, send me your detailed P&L, first there's a silence. And then the response is, okay, I'll have to talk to my accountants. And it's amazing because if they're an independent RIA, at least every 2 years, probably they're going to have to produce that report when they get audited. But the fact that it's a mystery to them, that they don't even know what's in it, is very telling. So
I'll tell you right now, by the way, you
yeah.
were like speaking the language of the Trulytics team. Terry Mullen on several occasions has said, I am shocked at the number of times I'm on stage
Mhm.
and I talk to advisors and I ask you about their P&L and how few hands go up. He's like, so few advisors have any idea what
Take it
their
even
business looks
further.
like.
Well, take it even further. Ask them how many of them have an operating budget for the current year.
Right? Yeah, that's true.
And they'll be like, what are you talking about? So, okay. So the first thing that I want to look at is, what is the true profit percentage? How much of your revenue do you ultimately keep? There's a wonderful book, and it gets a lot of credit for, again, a very simple idea that's been around since the beginning of time, but it's worth it. It's an easy book to read, called Profit First by Mike Langford. And if you've never read that book, again, I'm the kind of person, the more you talk to me, the more books I'll tell you to read. But
Yeah, it's great. I love it.
yeah.
I got a whole suggestion list going here.
But McCallowitz, he uses the old example of back in the 30s and 40s when nobody trusted banks anymore. There was a tendency to do personal budgeting using envelopes. And so, grandma would go to the, I hate to say it, but this is kind of how it's described. It's true, though. Grandma would go to the corner saloon on every Friday, because that's when grandpa got done from work, and he's there with his buddies having a beer. And she and all the other women in the neighborhood are getting that money from their husbands, and then they're taking it home. So they don't drink it. And then they're going home and they're putting money in the rent envelope, in the food envelope, the school envelope, the church envelope, whatever. That's the budgeting system that they use. They weren't going to use banks. They didn't believe in them. And it works, and it worked very well. McCallowitz observed that the major reason, in his opinion, why so many small businesses fail, and it's huge, is because they never took the time to put their profitability first. The owner, in many cases, makes less than some members of his staff. And he gives example after example across all industries, not just ours. So the first benchmark that I'm looking at is how much of your revenue is going to real operating expense. I'm not talking about stuff that you can write off as an operating expense, but it's really a personal benefit to you. Now I'm talking real operating expense, staff salaries, rent, supplies, marketing. What are those expenses that bring no direct benefit to you? If you're able to write off your company card, great, but that's a personal expense. So let's look at your expenses and let's extract out all the things that are true operating business. Now, let's look at that as a percentage of the whole. To me, there's no reason why financial advisors cannot be operating with a profit ratio of 60 to 65%, which means they're going to be spending no more than 35 to 40% on these real costs. So a big way to become your largest client, by the way,
Right.
is to make sure that you're not running a grocery store, but you're running a high margin practice, right? Okay, now, when we look at your existing expenses, let's take a look at those carefully. Which of those are absolutely essential? Meaning there's no way you can do that business without that. And we're all up for interpretation on what essential is. I'm actually a little bit more broad-minded than I think most people are. Like for me, I really think you need to have an office because I don't work well from home. I just don't. I have this little French bulldog who bugs me all day long, and I get nothing done when he's around. And I like him. So like half the time when he bugs me, it's like it's welcome, right? So I need an office, and I'm not a big believer in doing it all yourself. I want the advisor to be doing the $300 an hour work, not the $15 an hour work, right? So I do think having one administrative person, for the most part, is adequate. But there are things that we spend money on that, frankly, they're either wasteful, i.e., we've had the software program for the last 2 years. I've never used it once. It's kind of like having HBO on your cable package and you don't watch HBO. Now, I did it when there was Game of Thrones, and now Game of Thrones is over. I don't watch. Well, then get it off of there, right? There's also some things that are nice, but they're non-essential. Great example of that would be brand marketing. I have a buddy who likes to, well, he's not doing it this year, but he likes to have a billboard at the minor league ballpark in the town in which he lives. Now, has he ever gotten any bit of business from that? No, zero. But he likes it. It's maybe an ego gratifier, you know. He deludes himself into believing it's creating brand awareness for him. And I said, look, until you can put your name on a NFL stadium, you're not going to win the branding war, okay? Because that's what Raymond James does, okay? So that's wasteful. But in this case, I'd call it's not essential, but it's nice to have. Waste would be if he was, just buying stuff and he wasn't using it. So very often we can find a lot of those expenses. Now, I will tell you another thing that's often nice but non-essential is a significant percent of our staff. I know it's hard to admit, but a lot of firms have people on board that are not working full-time jobs. Oh, they're being paid like full-time people. And don't get me wrong, they're showing up full-time. But when we sit there and do an inventory of their responsibilities, we start to realize we have really one job broken up amongst 3 people. And the proof in that is the fact that once you implement certain systems on how you run your business and you start questioning the things that you do and why you do them, you will find yourself reducing the workload dramatically. So here's my practice where we manage about $200 million. We've got 225 clients in 20 states. They're spread out. We have one administrative person, and she works 4.5 days a week. She gets every Friday afternoon off. Now, that's a testament to her because she's very, very good, all right? But it's also a testament to the systems that we have in place that allow her to work very, very efficiently. So when I'm looking at the benchmarks, I want to see first, how much money are you truly keeping? Because a lot of times advisors will say to me how they would love to get to, say, I'm at 50 million of AUM now. I'd love to get to 100 million. And I'll respond by saying, well, how much money are you taking home now? And a good example, I can give you a real example without naming the person. It was just about that. It was about $50 million. And so he's bringing in about $500,000 a year of recurring revenue. And he says right away, I'd love to get to 100 million. To which I said, well, how much money would you like to take home? He says, well, ideally, I'd like to get to 250. Well, where are you at now? 125. Oof. So right now, he's got a 75% operating expense, right? Okay. So I said to him, well, before we think about doubling the business, why don't we look at how you're spending money? Because you know what? You may get to 250 without having to add on any business at all.
Right.
How would you like that? Of course, he's like, well, that would be great. And that's exactly what happened. By the time he left the office, we figured it out. Now, I didn't really do anything other than to point out to him, here's your revenue coming in, here's how you're choosing to use it, and questioning his various decisions. He was making a lot of bad marketing moves. In fact, and so often he wasn't even tracking his marketing. So he really wasn't certain what was successful or what wasn't. So he walks out of it, and this is one of the most powerful things that anyone ever said to me. He goes, you know what's great about all this? I can now call my wife and tell her she can quit her job.
That's
It's
wonderful.
just great. Oh my God.
Yeah.
She was doing a job she didn't like at all. And it was just amazing to me. And so those are the benchmarks. I want to see what's your profitability. Now, look, whether you want to be at 50% profit or 75% profit, that's your call. I'm just going to recommend a couple of things. Number one, 10% of your revenue has to go towards marketing because you've got to grow your business. But I don't want it to be any more than 10%. I don't. I want you to treat this like a marathon. Now, if you want it to be more, okay, but you've got to be conscious about this. So when I was talking about the budget, look, I use this analogy a lot. You read these stories about people who've climbed Mount Everest. And there's some great documentaries. So if you're not getting outside much these days, watch them.
Right.
A lot of people try to climb Mount Everest and die. Okay. You don't want to treat that mountain lightly. Okay. You got to treat it with a lot of respect. There's a lot of thought and science, even to the conditioning that you must do personally before you can climb, the time of the year that you go, all those things. When you get to the top of Mount Everest, you're not surprised. You're relieved, but you expect it to get there. All right. It's the same when it comes to budgeting in our business. You have to start every year planning where every dollar is going to go. And if you do that, you're going to hit your mark. In fact, even if revenue is lower than expected, you'll hit your mark. And this kind of gets back to profit first. So if I, for example, said, okay, here's my recurring revenue from 2019. And I usually recommend, as a starting point, you expect your recurring revenue for the next year to be the absolute same. Kind of like for the reason you just gave before when you were talking about the example. So I'm expecting my growth to be flat. Now, and really, once your practice gets to a certain size, you're really dependent on what the overall equity markets do more than you are new.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's my challenge. So, okay. So let's just assume, because who could have foreseen a virus? We have the same revenues going into next year. All right, fine. 40% is going to go to operating expense. That means every time we get paid any amount of money by anybody, only 40% of that money stays in the business. The remaining 60% leaves immediately. It either goes into owner's pay, a tax account, or an investment account for the owner. We're only going to keep 40% in. If revenue is down, well, everything across the board is going to be down by a percentage. But we're not going to give up owner's pay 100%, which is too often what owners do, or profitability. No, everything's down 20%. Okay, fine. I now have to run this business with 20% less revenue this quarter. And by the way, I always recommend you budget and monitor your budget quarter by quarter. There's a lot of reasons for that, but it just works a lot better. And so it's interesting because, all right, so here we are, we're in the middle we're approaching the end of the second quarter of the year. Clearly, I think everybody is down year to date. I bill quarterly, but it's highly likely that my revenues for the next quarter, the third quarter, are going to be higher only because markets have recovered.
Right.
Okay, fine. But I made the adjustments for this quarter. So the percentage of revenue that's going to go to profit is going to stay the same. The percentage of revenue that goes to taxes is going to stay the same, which, by the way, this is another unique thing. If you take out a percentage of revenue every single time you get paid for taxes, you will never have a tax problem. Now, at the end...
They call that tax planning for fancy people.
Yeah. Now, even if you never look at your budget throughout the year, if you finance your accounts, your business account and your personal accounts using those targeted percentages, you will hit your budget by default. You may not hit the same subcategories, but you're going to hit it because you only kept in your business account the exact amount of money you said you needed to run it, or you actually put in less. So that's how I like to do it. To me, you need to focus around hitting profitability. Now, we can set other metrics in terms of improving the number of people that we meet and the ones who become clients. There's a lot of other subcategories of that. But most advisors ignore the most important thing. They'll be able to tell you a little bit of their ROI on their marketing expenses, but that's about it. And as far as where their money is going, they have no idea. And that's a real shame because the key to making yourself wealthy is to know where that money's going.
100% agree with that concept. It's funny that you mentioned that on the onboarding process for the Truelytics system, right? So for True Performance, more specifically, a lot of those questions have to be asked, and that's one of the things that we've had to evangelize to the users is, hey, getting a grip on how your money is flowing, understanding your business as a business really helps to get that information in there, see how you measure up against benchmarks, other advisors that are your peers, other businesses that are similar in size and scope and structure as yours. And then you'll know how you're performing, and then you'll understand how much your business is worth and what your options are to grow and improve that business. But you really have to have a base level of understanding first. One of the things that, I guess the way that you and I got put together here is because you actually produce a podcast as well. And it builds on that concept of having marketing budget, of actually having 10% for your marketing budget. By the way, I love that number. I know the industry average is somewhere around 3%, which is frighteningly low. Like, show me a business that you respect that has a marketing budget of 3%. Any business, Apple, which is one of the biggest companies in the history of the world, spends way more than 3%. It's probably even more than 10% of their annual budget on marketing to make sure you're using iPhones and everything else.
But you know what, Mike, if I can interrupt just a second, you were absolutely right. 3% is bad. 33% is bad also.
Yes, it is.
So many advisors have bought into this idea that they're creating a money machine.
Yeah.
And what they don't realize is that their personal resources are finite. So this idea that if I just keep spending, I make more, it's wonderful in textbook theory. It doesn't work out. Yeah, it doesn't work out in real life. So it goes that way. I use 10% because I've always said you can give up 10% of anything in your life and not miss it. If you want to use 15 or even 20%, fine, but make sure it's a conscious decision. It's not something you just happen to get there by doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So let's talk a little bit about the podcast. So first of all, what caused you to launch the podcast? I've listened, as I mentioned, to one episode in its entirety, kind of pick and choose a little bit of the other ones to sample them. You're doing a great job with it. What was the thing that got you to say, I'm rolling it up, let's go?
Well, we started the Profitable Advisor podcast largely because there was a message a lot of financial advisors weren't hearing, which was you got to run your business profitably. So many,
what a concept.
Yeah. I mean, so many of them were just, again, they're taking their direction from product vendors who they really, I'd argue they don't even want you to be super profitable, because the day you're super profitable, the day you're wealthy is the day you don't need them. And you may actually decide to stop working. And let's face it, there are only so many good advisors out there. So they need to keep you really hungry. The podcast was really just a very easy and effective way to promote what we do. So I think every advisor should have a podcast. Now, for an advisor, I think that I know the podcast isn't necessarily going to bring you a lot of new clients. What it's going to do is nurture your existing clients. And if you have a good marketing system, it's going to nurture your list in a way that is so much more effective than anything that you can do. So I always say marketing is about building a list. And if you build a list of people, you can't control when they're ready to work with you, but you can nurture them properly. And the podcast is such a powerful thing to do that. So I don't know how many people I've helped them. Well, I don't do podcast production myself, but we've told them you got to, probably well over 100 advisors in the last 3 years have started podcasts really at my urgence, because I just think it's such an effective way to get in the ear of your audience. You can, especially if you have an interesting topic, if you have an interesting subject. What made the Profitable Advisor podcast so well received was because I was providing a message that really not a lot of people are talking about. And whatever podcasts that are out there for financial advisors, very few of them are actually done by financial advisors. And if they are done by financial advisors, they tend to be very technical. They don't really talk about what I think is the fun part, which is profitability and having the type of freedom that you want. Now, there's more coming out on the horizon, but so many podcasts that I see nowadays, they're really just another way to sell the product to the vendor, which is fine. They serve a purpose, and I listen to them. But to have a fresh message, a fresh face from someone who does what your audience does, that's very helpful. So it's a podcast for advisors by an advisor. And it often delivers a message that they don't hear quite as often. So that's kind of how it took off. And I cannot imagine, I have three of them now. And I can't, three podcasts. And I just can't imagine not having a business without having one. It's just the best way to communicate to your customer.
I couldn't agree more. I've been doing podcasts since '07. And one of the things that I have discovered is it really just helps build a relationship with
Oh, yeah.
your existing customers, with your referral partners, right? The influencers of your potential customers and your existing customers. And then, of course, prospects. One of the things that often goes overlooked, frankly, is a prospect, specifically in today's day and age, is going to check you out.
Yeah.
So if you meet somebody, when we get back to normal and we're out there mingling and you hand them a business card and you say, hey, I'm Mike Langford, or hey, I'm Dan.
Mhm.
One of the first things they're going to do before they book a meeting with you is they're going onto Google. They're going to go onto your website. They're going to explore to validate that you are who you say you are and to kind of
Right.
see if you're the right fit for them. And part of that journey is not only going to be reading, but it's going to be looking for rich media. So they will be looking to see if there's any video. They will be looking to see if there's podcast and audio. And because podcasts are so easily digestible, right, consumable, that they can click it, they can listen to it, they can subscribe. And then while they're doing whatever they're doing, driving, mowing the lawn, vacuuming, cooking, they can be listening to you and getting comfortable with your voice so that when you do sit down with that person at a desk or whatever, or across the table, whatever, they feel like they know you already.
There's no doubt. And the thing too is you don't even have to let them find you. If you're smart about it, you're going to push that podcast on them.
Right.
So for example, see, I'm a big believer that not everybody you meet is a good prospect to work
Right.
with. So I always recommend that prospects listen to certain podcasts where we have talked about who's ideal and who's not before they even bother to schedule an appointment with us, because I use that as a filtering.
That's
So,
really smart.
Yeah. So everything you said is absolutely right. And and you can repurpose your podcast in so many ways. But another thing too is it will distinguish you from the masses. Here's the beautiful thing. If you're an independent financial advisor, let's face it, the guys who work for the big operations and the gals who work for the big operations, they can't do their own podcasts.
Right. Yeah.
Their compliance department would never let them do it.
Yeah.
Not in a million years. Right.
Oh, yeah. If you do a podcast for a big firm, or even
Yeah.
if you have a guest from a big firm on your podcast, you've got to deliver the transcript of that podcast, and compliance wants to review it before they can put it out. Right. Whereas you or I or anybody else could, that's
Yeah.
independent or smaller business, fire it up. And if I want to, I can have this pod out later this afternoon.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, and you really should do it. And too often I'll hear advisors, they'll be like, well, I'm just not really comfortable speaking. I said, look, first of all, no matter what you do, whenever you start, by where you'll be a year from now, you're going to be terrible. Okay. Just accept it. All right. I go back and I cannot listen to my first few podcasts. They're so bad.
Right.
In fact, I very rarely listen to any of my stuff, but because I know what I said when I said it, and I don't want to have to beat myself up later. But I said, look, you have to understand, it's like acne. You think it's worse than the average person does, and you will get better doing it. So it's just one of those many things. It's a system. And to me, podcast, in marketing, we have 9 systems. And one of those systems is client retention. And the podcast is one of the key parts of the client retention system. So if for just that reason alone, I couldn't imagine not having a podcast.
Love it.
Because then to me, that would mean I don't have a client retention system.
Love it. So as we get close to wrap it up here, I wanted to hit 2 quick things. Number one, the podcast that I listened to, the episode that I listened to from your Profitable Advisor show was on target marketing. And for me, it was like gold, because I have been banging on that drum for years and years and years. Over a decade now, just talking about how important it is to have a niche, to have a specific target market that you're dealing with. What if you could offer a couple of quick bullet points from your perspective on why it's so important for an advisor or a firm itself to have a target market, or even a couple of series of target markets or niches that they serve?
Yeah. So to begin with, the reason that I've been harping on it a lot now is because once the COVID virus hit, traditional marketing techniques went out the window. And what I started to notice was advisors panicking. And they were just looking for ways to spend money to just say they were doing something when it comes to marketing. There's a number of advisors with whom I work who have become known as the person in a particular industry. So, for example, there's a woman out of Atlanta who is the go-to financial advisor for optometrists. In fact, her entire practice is built around that. You go to her website, you're going to see an optometrist giving an examination on her website, okay?
Yeah.
She goes to industry meetings. She speaks at a number of optometrical groups. If optometrical is a word, I don't know if it is, but I think it might be.
It is today. Now it is.
It works. It works. It sounded like a smart word, right? That's all she does. So when this thing hit, it was funny. I called her and I said, so how's this going? And she goes, wow, it's really taken off for us. And the reason for that was because the optometrists who were on her list, they had to close their offices.
Yeah.
So they were more than available for her podcasting. And she's built and her webinars. Her podcasting and her webinars were now going to be consumed massively because you've got all these optometrists really with nothing to do. And they're worried. They're really worried that, oh my Lord, what's going to happen? And she was able to speak to that. What makes target marketing so powerful is that your message is going to be heard more clearly by the people that are in that target market. You're going to be a big fish in a small but deep pool. And as a result of that, you're not going to have to spend nearly the same amount of money that you would have to spend if you're going to be a generalist. In her case, her average client is much bigger than most financial advisors. She has the ability to not do business with anybody simply because if they're not an optometrist, she can always play that card if she wants. Now, whether you become the go-to person for optometrists or another industry doesn't matter. But I will tell you this. If I was to tell everybody, okay, go out and find out everything there is to know about an optometry practice, they wouldn't do it. I wouldn't expect them to do it. In fact, in her case, she was born into that culture. It was just a natural fit for her. Although, frankly, other than the fact that she had learned things from being in that culture, she didn't really get any advantages from it. But the other examples that I see work really, really well is take a look at your existing client list now and look and see where they work at. Where did they work at? So like in Cincinnati, for example, and I tell this story, a number of years ago, I lost a client of mine who was a Procter & Gamble employee. Now, we had the best relationship. And he didn't have a ton of money with me, but he was going to have a ton of money with me when he retired. And at Procter & Gamble, they really do want you to retire around age 55. So when he calls me, and I know we're getting ready close to retirement, and he goes, listen, it's hard for me to tell you this, but I've decided I'm going to go work at a different firm. And, did I do something wrong? He said, no. These guys, though, they specialize in Procter & Gamble employees. Now, between you and me, I know that plan like the back of my hand. Okay, there's nothing you can tell me about the Procter & Gamble retirement plan that they don't know. But that was their target market. That's all they do. And as a result, guess what? He probably knows 50 of their clients. So when they invited him to a social event, it was like going to a P&G alumni.
Yeah.
It was brilliant. I went to their website. There it was, the P&G building, right there on their website. Okay, now they might get a cease and desist letter at some point, but until then, you can take a picture of the Cincinnati skyline and it's there. Sure, you can't avoid it. So, but that's what they did. It was brilliant. It was very, very smart. And at that point I said, okay, no more generalization. Okay, we target. Now, I still don't think my firm does a very good job at it, which is why lately, like on this, I've got a series of podcasts coming with those really good niche marketers, so that I can learn better myself and apply it. But you're going to find that these current conditions that we're in, or whatever throws at you next, isn't going to affect you that much when you are a specialist. Now, that industry in which you're specializing in, like, say, optometrists, and this is one of the things we talked a lot about, what was the future of that industry? Because if that industry goes away, you're going to have to shift gears. But that's okay. Once you know how to do it, and once you know how to build a list within that niche, it's easily transferable.
Well, and if you're like in that space, it's not going to sneak up on you, right?
No.
So if you have a large client roster of optometrists,
Mhm.
you're not going to suddenly look at it and go, what happened? They're all out of business.
Yeah.
It's not going to catch you by surprise. You're going to notice their margins are slipping and a
Right.
lot of things are happening in that space, and you will have been along for that ride. And hopefully you weren't just like sitting there with blinders on. But
Well, what's interesting too, but like in her case, and she pointed this out, she says, she goes, I know this is going to sound counter logical, but the demise of their industry would actually help me. I said, why? She says, because they're all going to have to then sell their practices.
yeah,
And she says, what are they going to do with that money? Now she says, now look, eventually you're right. They'll go away. But when we're going through that, she said, that's really where one of her expertise is showing them what they need to sell their practice for. And then she pivots
right.
into working with, financial. One last thing I do want to say though about target marketing, because a lot of advisors are a little bit scared to do it. They think if I target market, then people outside my target market will never want to do business with me. And first of all, I would tell you that may not be a bad thing, particularly if you latch on to that niche. But no, that's not really true. And I'll tell you why. So I talked about Procter & Gamble. Well, Cincinnati is a town that has three major employers. Is Procter & Gamble, there's GE Aircraft, and there is, Kroger. So three major Fortune 500 companies that are headquartered there. Every employee of those companies feels that they are every bit as bright and as talented as the person at the other company. So if you met someone at GE, they think that they're every bit as bright and talented as people in Procter & Gamble, and vice versa. There's an affinity there. So if someone goes on your website and they see you specialize, they're an engineer, say at GE Aircraft, and they see that you're specializing in Procter & Gamble employees, I assure you that's not going to hurt you. No more than the guy who's been driving BMWs. He's not going to be afraid to go check out Mercedes.
Right.
So you're going to get that same type of affinity, and it's going to work out fine. What you're basically saying is, yeah, we work with corporate people who have above average means, but you have very wisely developed marketing materials that actually name their employer, name the plan that they have. Now, if you're afraid that you're going to get a cease and desist from these companies, then fine. Make it slightly more generic. So for example, Procter & Gamble, I know they're in a lot of things. Let's just say they're in the soap business. Fine. Instead of developing marketing materials where you blatantly call out their name, you talk about employees and executives of a soap manufacturer.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Have the same effect. They're going to see it.
Yeah.
Instead of calling out their profit sharing plan by name, fine. You talk about a certain type of profit sharing that might have these features to it.
Yeah.
So you can definitely get around doing it that way. But yeah, you're going to find that your marketing is going to be much more effective. You're not going to spend nearly the amount of money. You're going to definitely get more referrals because you're going to be able to have alumni events like the advisor who stole from me. And I give him all the credit. I learned so much. That's the greatest theft.
Yeah.
Most people don't get excited when someone steals something. I learned so much from that.
Fantastic.
If I ever meet them, I'm going to go, by the way, thanks for taking Vladimir away from me.
Exactly.
I learned.
The best lesson of my life. Okay, well, hey, listen, I have one little quick one. If you could hit me on 60 seconds on this one as we close out. You and I are recording on a Friday, so a lot of people heading into the weekend. What is one little piece of advice or thing you could encourage an advisor to do today or over the weekend that would make their business more profitable? What's that little quick tip that they could do, like something actionable as we leave the stage?
Okay. Without a doubt, the most powerful thing that I do as a marketer, if we're going to talk marketing, is I write a daily email to my list. In fact, I call it the almost daily email. Now, I'll let you know a little secret. After doing it for a while, I hired somebody else to do it for me.
Right. Smart.
But regular communication to your list is huge. And I hear people say, won't I annoy them? Not the people who are interested in you. Won't they opt out? Let them opt out. If they opt out, it means they weren't going to do business with you anyway. But that little tip, which I was highly resistant to, I learned about 3 years ago from a guy named Dave D. And he promised me, so it'll revolutionize your business. It'll revolutionize your business, and it revolutionized mine. So I write a daily email to advisors. If you go to dancuprill.com, if you want to see it, you can get it. You can see how I write it. I think you'll find it to actually be quite entertaining, but if after a day or two you don't like it, you can always opt out. But that daily email has been, for me, one of the most powerful things that I've ever done. And I really recommend any business, but especially financial advisors, if you've taken the time to have workshops and have people come and they didn't become clients, You need to nurture those people. The daily email is one of the most effective ways to do it.
Love it. All right. Perfect. Thank you, Dan. Well, I really appreciate you being on the show, buddy.
I enjoyed it, and I thank you again. And I hope we gave some people some real good actionable items that they can take advantage on and profit from.
I agree. I think they will. All right. Thanks, sir. Okay. Huge thanks to Dan Cuprill for joining us today. Please make sure you check out his site, advisorarchitect.com. And an even huger thanks to you for listening to the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. This show is for you, so please do reach out and let us know if you have questions or suggestions for guests or topics to be on the show. You just ping us at podcast@truelytics.com. Hit us up on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, YouTubes. Heck, swing by the Truelytics website and drop us a line there via the contact thing. We want to hear from you because, by the way, that's how Dan ended up on the show. A colleague reached out and said, hey, this guy, Dan Cuprill, would be really good for the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. He also has a podcast. You should check it out. It's really cool. He's got lots of listeners. Well, Dan and I chatted, and he was a great fit for the show. So there you go. Great conversation with Dan today. I think you enjoyed it. We've also had several other guests come to the show via that exact same methodology, hearing from you, the audience, from people that you want to hear. And even if that person that you want to hear from is you, maybe if you're a good fit. So reach out. Love to hear from you. Okay. Please do make sure you stay safe, wear your mask, keep your distance from those among us who are likely to be the most vulnerable. And we will see you next time on the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. See ya. Bye.